I'm going to focus on how centennialism and a heightened national identity contributed to the emergence of the heritage movement after 1967. I also want to frame it around what was the national capital at the time, namely where modernity was reconciling with history and identity and, of course, cultural nationalism. This cultural nationalism can be traced through the works of Harold Innis, of course, Creighton, Northrop Frye, Hugh MacLennan, and George Grant, and in English Canada. And essentially, it was Canada becoming non-American in the post-war period through its anti-war position or its freedom on the margins, what Northrop Frye has called the quest for the peaceable kingdom. Think peacekeeping versus the Vietnam War, or a peaceful kingdom with our, in fact, romantic Gothic Parliament buildings versus the militaristic neoclassicism of Washington. This awakening of 1960s cultural nationalism was encouraged by Canada's centennial fever in Expo 67, but also by an internationalism through a youth culture that was breaking away from the modern movement and its tenets. I want to first begin, though, in 2017, and then jump back in time to the 1950s, and finally settle on the national capital in 1967. First, modernism is about overconsumption. It's about the cycle of creation, obsolescence, decay, demolition, and then construction. Per capita, Canadians pollute the most in the world. Today, in fact, I believe that all projects should be focused on sustainability, and that includes prevention of demolition and meeting the greenhouse gas emission reductions, and of course maintaining historic buildings, even ones from the 60s and 70s and even more recent heritage. So heritage conservation is, in fact, about sustainability. And in 2017, we can see the maturation of this field in the national capital. We are, in fact, much more sophisticated in heritage conservation than we were 50 years ago. A good example of this is the Carleton Immersive Media Studio, employing digitization programs, building information management, performance simulations, robotics, augmented work, and of course still doing the tried and true craftsmanship to conserve these places. Saving the Strutt House from demolition by the NCC, and then having it designated and now undergoing restoration is, in fact, living sustainably. Or the creative experimentation at the Moore Farm, a horse farm once owned by the Parker family. The Parker family was known, of course, for their pens. And this is now used as a farm co-op and an ecology center. Before 1967, Canada was an emerging post-war power in the world. It was increasingly diverse, shifting away from a resource-based economy and shedding its colonial identity. The Quiet Revolution had begun in Quebec. A Bill of Rights had passed, and Indigenous people could finally vote. The maple leaf became the national flag, and O Canada began to be sung as the national anthem. Before 1967, there was some conservation of historic places in Canada, especially through the National Historic Sites program at Parks Canada, and by the provinces, first led by Quebec, and then by other provinces, which supported conservation initiatives, albeit often as essentially reconstructions or turning heritage sites into museums. For example, Louisbourg in Nova Scotia and Cape Breton. The emergence of a new awareness of heritage happened when there was an intersection of two approaches in public service institutions responding to societal change, which of course we can see at the National Capital Commission. So where does, in fact, the NCC fit into our topic today? Let's quickly examine the idea of heritage in the context of the National Capital Commission before 1967. First, the Federal District Commission's mandate, that's what the National Capital Commission used to be called, from the late 1940s to the end of the 1960s was essentially to implement the Grey Bear Plan, a beautification plan implemented by expropriating and acquiring land, eliminating working class and industrial areas from the core, developing a car-centric city, decentralizing government campuses, expanding parklands, creating ex-urban areas beyond a greenbelt, and creating scenic drives. The Grey Bear Plan was very powerful and a significant transformative plan that was essentially completed by the late 1960s. It was so powerful that it could push Ottawa City Hall to land on a former industrial island outside of the downtown core. The plan did acknowledge history, but aside from preserving the Rideau Canal, there was no interest in conserving other built heritage. It was, however, interested in designed landscapes, such as preservation of Gatineau Park. Of course, throughout the plan, there's no reference to heritage conservation. In 1959, during the 24th session of Parliament, it passed the National Capital Act, creating the new National Capital Commission. It had the ability to, quote, administer, preserve, and maintain any historic place or historic museum. By 1961, Anthony Adamson, the NCC's vice chair, had spearheaded the first study on acquisition and protection of historic buildings and sites. Adamson bridged two worlds and several generations. He could work with the high modernists of the era and also the preservationists. He was a patrician, descended from colonial wealth, but he may have been open enough to critical responses to commodified modernism, such as Jane Jacobs' work that she published in 1961. So, what was a historic place for the NCC and Adamson in the early 1960s? Essentially, pre-Confederation stone buildings. The Fraser Schoolhouse, the lone surviving house of NCC demolitions along Sussex Drive, for example, or the Thompson Perkins Mill, which would eventually be adapted and reused in the early 1970s as a restaurant, or Maple Lawn, known also as Rochester House, which was acquired in 1952 along with its farm that would partly be used for the future McDonald Parkway. While these places were being acquired by the NCC, the modernists were reconceiving the national capital with the power of the Grey Bear Plan for example, Spark Street Mall, also called Mall of the Four Seasons by Jacques Grébert. This would open as a permanent pedestrian street by 1967 to the designs of Watson Balhari and his design team, who was an NCC committee member. Or the urban redevelopment of Confederation Square and the train yards, which would include the demolition of Union Station, the Daly Building, and buildings along Elgin Street. Here's a photo of Diefenbaker admiring the demolition plan. Remember, this was during his years that there was a discussion about demolishing the East Block and replacing it with a contemporary office block. LeBreton Flats expropriations began in 1962, with demolition of the whole neighborhood completed by 1965. Or the demolition of the north end of Lower Town to build the Macdonald-Cartier Bridge and the new headquarters for Foreign Affairs, now known as the Lester B. Pearson Building. So why is 1967 such an important year? Well, aside from the centennial year, and of course Expo 67, it was when the idea of a global village truly begins. On June 25, 1967, the famous professor of pop, Marshall McLuhan, introduced Our World. the first global broadcast via satellite. This simultaneous television happening had no other than these four musicians singing to 400 million people their number one hit, All You Need Is Love. Dressed in ironic military outfits, the Beatles were experimental, exploring traditional instruments and reflecting a youth culture. There were love-ins that year, even in fact one at the Expo Youth Pavilion. There were protests, and of course a search for a new youth identity. Anti-bourgeois fashion of 1967 was often inspired by clothing of a century earlier. Now, however naive, in hindsight, the summer of 1967 was, it was the summer of love, and when Canada grew up. The centennial reflected a new national era and awareness for everyone, but especially through the youth generation. It was celebratory, but also a maturation of our sense of self, and heralded a new wave of progressive policies and politics. By 1969, Trudeau-mania had happened. Being gay was legal. The country was officially bilingual, and there was universal medical. If 1967 was a watershed year, and the beginnings of a shift away from colonial identity and embracing a progressive culture, then what can we understand of the idea of heritage and history after 1967? Let's turn to the National Capital Commission in the 1960s as a case in point. The Crown Corporation, led by Alan K. Hay throughout the 1960s, who in fact was a descendant of the politician who chose the name Ottawa for the capital, followed two hemispheres of intentions. On the one hand, there was the Design Advisory Committee, made up of pure modernists. On the other hand, the historians on the Historical Advisory Committee were modeling themselves after the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. In fact, many of the members sat on both boards. So what was the intersection between the modernist designers and the historians? First, they were not opposed to each other. The Historical Advisory Committee spent much of their time on inventories of buildings, a commemorative plaquing program, developing communications on the history of the region, and working in consultation with local citizens, organizations, and historical societies in Ottawa. Much of the work was on protecting and rehabilitating early houses in the region. I believe that the worlds of reductionist modernist principles and historicism came closer together with one innovative project at the NCC that anticipates the direction heritage conservation would take: the Sussex Drive Historical Restoration Project. Now, this is where Vice Chair Adamson surprises us with bringing together both history and design into a new form of urban revitalization. Adamson, with Peter John Stokes as consultant and as chief architect, John Leaning, was able to pioneer the urban rehabilitation of Sussex Drive as the Mile of History. John Leaning, an important conservation architect, would work on this until he quit the National Capital Commission in December of 1967. The Sussex Drive restoration was a pioneering effort of urban rehabilitation, preservation, and restoration. Whatever your opinion of it is today, the project was bold and comprehensive and became a centennial project, despite the Pearson Liberals' reluctance to support the full project, since it was hatched under Diefenbaker's Conservatives. In 1967, the Mile of History is the beginnings of how urban renewal would mark the change from demolition to conservation. In fact, at 521 Sussex Drive, local architect Matt Stankiewicz, with Dennis Faulkner, converted the NCC-owned building while retaining the interior features into a music venue called Le Hibou Coffee House, the very place where youth culture congregated to listen to poets, to musicians, and to even having a visit by none other than George Harrison. In Canada's centennial year of 1967, heritage was only beginning to be an important concept. The federal government's Centennial Memorial Program emphasized modernity and the future, not the past. The Canadian interpretations of brutalist architecture, for example the NAC, many other cultural centers across the country, were often a reflection of a garrison mentality and derived inspiration from the landscape, with few projects focused on heritage conservation. Although one exception was the restoration of St. Lawrence Hall, National Historic Site in downtown Toronto. The National Capital Commission was in fact straddling both sides, modernity and looking to the future, but also looking to the past. Until then, restoration was no more than restoring early stone buildings. But the beginnings of a more integrated approach to heritage conservation was emerging from the NCC in the 1960s. Now, it didn't mean that demolition of historic places halted by the early 70s. Of course, lots more demolition was to unfortunately come. What did occur in 1967 was an awakening to a new Canada through the spirit of centennialism, one that appreciated a domestic heritage that was more than colonial homes. This historical awareness was part of a younger generation of baby boomers who were forming their own sense of what was of value in their culture and wanting to understand their country. 1967 can be considered when Canada and the national capital began to see its history through an influential youth culture that saw the past, celebrated during the centennial, as something to embrace and to take as a counterculture to those so-called stiff white shirt modernists, and permit all Canadians to form new perspectives of heritage and their own history. I want to conclude my presentation by reflecting this greater awareness of history and built heritage with the eventual outcome of one special building here in Ottawa, the former Union Station. The NCC was intent from the early 1960s on to demolish the former Union Station and redevelop Confederation Square. And yet, where did 1,500 people gather to herald in the centennial year, dressed in 19th century garb? Union Station. Where did 1,600 mini-skirted girls and mod youths dance at Hopsville 67? Well, at Union Station. And by 1970, Union Station became the new government conference center, saved from demolition. And today it remains there, now being rehabilitated as a swing space for the Senate of Canada.